Today I'm talking to Russell Mills, a visual artist whose work has often been used for album artwork for acts like Nine Inch Nails, Peter Gabriel, the Cocteau Twins and Brian Eno. I think I'm going to start with maybe a bit of a difficult question for you, because you work with visual artwork, music and set design and things like that. You've got a broad range of things that you do. Yes. I was wondering how you would characterise your work. How would you describe it to someone who'd never seen or heard it?
That is really difficult. I mean, to answer your question precisely, I don't know how one would characterise it sort of succinctly.
Because I think of your most recognisable works as being the stuff that you've done that's on Nine Inch Nails album covers and things like that. So
yes.
The works that you do of your own that you show in galleries yourself, I just think of that as being the Russell Mills style. Is that fair to say?
Kind of. It's a big. This leads to a sort of big cultural question, I think, or an anomaly really. In England, and I use that England rather than the UK. There's always been a suspicion of people who work in many areas of creativity, and I think it's the same in sciences actually, although they're far more open to dialogue and exchange of ideas. Whereas everywhere else in the world, it seems as though people are celebrated when they can do more than one thing, And I've always found that very odd. And when I was at art college, I was immediately kind of depressed with art college because I thought this is where I can try things, experiment, fall over, fail, get up again. And they actually put you into little boxes. Oh no, you're in this department. You're doing ceramics or whatever, and therefore you're not allowed to go to printmaking. And I thought, I was thinking, well, what if I did some printmaking with ceramics and metalwork? What would that create? That will create another kind of hybrid. And even in art schools, that was sort of shunned, that kind of way of thinking. So I was kind of angry all the time when I was at art school.
I'm always very surprised to hear about art school being anything but liberal, really. So it must be quite strange to find any opposition to wanting to be creative like that.
Well, I mean, that's a little unfair. I think the art schools, when I was going through art schools, were incredibly liberal. I mean, best education one could have. But within that, there were these kind of constraints that were mainly, I think, imposed because of purely logistical reasons, Having sort of 500-600 students just roaming around a building, doing whatever they wanted, was uncontrollable, physically and, I guess, financially. How do we manage this? So there were those reasons for it being like that, but there were also traditional reasons for this kind of zoning off of activities, and there was a kind of snobbery involved as well. If you were a fine artist, that's another thing I've never understood. Why do they so desperate they need to put the word fine before artist?
Yeah.
Paranoid. If you're a fine artist, you were considered like Liverpool or Manchester United, at the top. If you were in design, graphic design, you were down in sort of with Barnsley or Altrincham, And they never kind of considered that these were sort of fellow travellers, and they always conveniently forgot their own art history training, whereby, like one of my heroes, Leonardo da Vinci, just did everything. When he was curious about something, he just went and explored it and fiddled around and tried things, And I always believe that's what artists should do, is to try and open up new ways of looking and seeing and making,
To use your football table analogy there, where did you sit in the league? What were you specialising in at university?
I wasn't. I was deliberately not specialising. That's even though I was put into departments, you have to, when you go through art school, as you probably know, you go through foundation course, which is fantastic. That's where you're allowed to do everything, And I always thought that the rest of one's art school life should be an extended foundation course, basically. But as soon as you've done foundation course, you're still, I was 17, I was the youngest in the art school. I really didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't. All I knew for certain about anything in life was that I didn't want a job.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me that art school was a way of avoiding a job. Yeah. I needed time to breathe to find out who I was. But after a year of foundation, I obviously still didn't know what I was doing and who I was. But you're immediately forced to or obliged to make a decision which will kind of shape the rest of your life. And you have to choose a subject, a specialisation. And I really, as I say, I didn't know what I was doing. So I went into design and I was taken by a new university in Stoke. I think it was called Trent. And they were starting up what they kept promoting as an experimental department. And I lasted 2 weeks. It was appalling. And I was.
What did they have you doing?
Well, you had to sign in every morning for one thing. And the first the first project they set was to devise kind of infographics for crime rates. Oh fuck this! I'm not doing this. I couldn't bear it.
It doesn't sound like there's much experimentation going on there.
No, there wasn't. So I left. But in order to leave, I had to find another college. So I travelled around the country, visiting former fellow students from my foundation at Canterbury, sleeping on floors and looking in other universities and colleges to see what was going on. And then I ended up sort of 20 miles away from where I started. I ended up at Maidstone, which seemed to have a very kind of liberal campus. There were some really exciting people there. Like Ian Dury was there teaching from the Blockheads. Kilburn and the High Road started there. David Hockney used to come down there and teach. Michael Nyman used to come down. It was the only art school in the country with a recording studio at the time. And I went there again to do design, but I didn't really want to do design, and I ended up doing sort of making pictures, collage. Not really knowing what it was about, and people told me this is illustration. Well, okay, all right, if you say so.
After recording, Russell got in touch wanting to make the following changes to what he said. Firstly, he said that Ian Dury was a visiting tutor at Maidstone College, when in fact he was a visiting tutor at the Canterbury School of Art, where he was on a foundation course. And he also wanted to add that Bruce McLean and David Hockney were also visiting tutors. Russell was the unofficial assistant of David Hockney during some of his printmaking sessions. And at the end of David's tenure, he gave Russell a print that he made, and Russell still has that today.
So I sort of drifted into illustration, and then I was lucky enough to get into the Royal College to do an MA. Again, I went there to visit, and I looked around the fine art studios, and I thought, these people are just masturbating. This is all about me and angst, and none of them are talking to one another. It's boring. And I walked across the corridor to this scruffy little place. I didn't even know what it was called, and it was the illustration studio, which only took 10 students a year from around the world. And it was full of the most amazing people I'd ever met in my life, just really extraordinary eccentrics.
Oh, wow.
Like do you know the Quay brothers?
I don't actually know.
They make extraordinary stop frame animation films. They're identical twins from Philadelphia, but they spoke with a BBC accent. Very tall, very thin, very leonine. And they were in there working on a drawing together, physically together. I thought, this is interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. So you found that you fit in a little bit better with that crowd?
Yeah, I went for an interview there, and the interview went kind of okay. I arrived, and the department then was, the Royal College had the fine art and illustration and design was all down part of the V&A building now. And we used to share toilets with the V&A. And I went for my interview, and I sat there, and it was running late. And the porter, who was an Irish guy who was there when I was there, he came out with a little plastic cup and said, "Here, have this," because he saw I was really nervous, and it was whiskey. And as the interviews were running late, I kind of sat there for hours, and finally my bladder was bursting, and it was a day when the toilets in the Royal College were leaking again. So you were given a key to go into the V&A and through these labyrinth corridors to find the V&A toilets. So I scuttled off and had a wee and came back. And of course I'd been called in while I was away. So I was late for my interview. I was stinking of whiskey, and I found out afterwards that my flies were open.
Nightmare.
Yeah. Anyhow, the interview went very well despite all that. And at the end of it, they said, "What do you?" I was asked if I had a question for them. I said, "Well, what can you do for me?" And they said, "We'll allow you to do whatever you want to do, and we'll make you do it better." And I thought, that sounds all right to me. There was a real kind of ethos of exchange and collaboration, and it wasn't sycophantic. It was incredibly critical as well. I mean, we had huge arguments, about aesthetics and design and music and all kinds of stuff. But it was basically constructive criticism. It was incredibly supportive, and it will also happened to coincide with the explosion of punk. So there was an incredible energy, not just at the college, but also from being in London at the time.
Do you think the punk attitude became part of your work? Did that kind of seep into what you were doing?
Well, I think it was there anyhow. I mean, my primary sources when I was at school, the people who I discovered and excited me were people like Kurt Schwitters and the Dadaists. And I'd been lucky enough, because my father was in the Air Force, we lived in Germany a lot without television or anything in those days. So radio was my kind of my source of touch, my umbilical cord to cultural things. And we also shared a lot of air bases, because it was during the Cold War. We shared a lot of air bases with the Americans, and my dad was in Bomber Command, so we were on these air bases that were actually out on the airfields. There were American bombers laden with nuclear bombs, surrounded by security guards. It was a really strange time. But at that time, some of them also had their own radio stations, and they were playing music that wasn't heard or available in the UK. So I discovered stuff like Captain Beefheart, like 10 years before anyone in the UK had ever heard of him.
It's amazing to think that he was being played in Germany before the UK, really.
Yeah. Well, some of the USAF people over there were really they were just mad on music, so this was part of their DNA. They were bringing this over to play to their own people, and a lot of really early soul and doo-wop stuff, which was kind of extraordinary to a white boy, 10-year-old boy in the middle of Germany, in this English oasis in Germany, surrounded by nuclear bombs.
Sounds like a very strange place to grow up, if I'm honest.
Very strange, but really formative as well, as I say, because of sound, I think, and radio. I got to listen to not only just that kind of music from America, but also various radio programs that were. There was a guy on Sundays. Everyone in the armed forces used to tune into what was called Two-Way Family Favourites, and it was a program that it was a request show where people in the UK would write into the radio program and send a message to one of their relatives who was serving somewhere else in the world, and vice versa, and they'd play a piece of music, a contemporary topical piece of, usually kind of ballad stuff, nothing too exciting. But there was also another program on a Sunday which we listened to religiously. It was called Radio Roundup by a guy called Jack Jackson, and he used to play extremely weird stuff, very strange, and he'd link it together. The narratives in between each was, he would have recordings of contemporary comedy shows like The Goons, Round the Horn, Spike Milligan, people like that. He'd have them sent to him, and he would literally make copies of them, and then he would splice them with scalpels, take cuts of these phrases and little passages from these comedy programs and then restitch them all back together to make a completely different narrative. And he would weave this through his programs. So in between playing a piece of music, there'd be another section of narrative with this running joke and innuendo going on all the way through. And it was my first kind of introduction to what this idea of collage was.
Did you start making artwork when you were very young like that, when you were listening to that on the radio?
Yeah, I mean, again, apparently when I was very young, I had pictures in a national exhibition when I was 5, but I don't really remember that. And I've been lucky enough through all my schooling to have really good supportive art teachers who encouraged me. But I guess at that time, partly because we didn't have television, it was as I say, the only source of intellectual stimulation apart from books and other people was the radio, and that's where this kind of cultural world came into my head. I wasn't distracted by television until much later. So yeah, I guess, and I was always making art because I didn't have television to watch,
I wanted to talk about some album artwork stuff that you've done. A lot of your work has been, I think a lot of the way that most people will recognise your work is from its use on very successful album covers. Notably, people like Brian Eno and Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails has worked with you for years. A quote from Trent Reznor that I always remember is that he says that he has far more of an interest in the darker side of things than the light. And I was wondering if that's something that resonates with you, because your work really embodies what his work sounds like, in my view. And I was wondering if that's something that resonates with you, that quote.
Up to a point, I agree with it. Yeah, I think I've always liked this phrase. Blessed be the cracked. From out comes the light. Something like that, anyhow. I mean, you need the dark in order to appreciate the light. There's a lot of kind of cliches that one can throw around about dark and light. But I think most of my work is about transformation. It's about life and death. It's about the natural world. It's about processes of the natural world, in that a plant dies, and while it's dying it creates these things called auxins, which enable the next growth to appear. And nearly everything I do is basically about that. I wouldn't say it's about the darkness in terms of our consciousness or psyche, or angst. It's about the necessary. The dark is necessary in order for light to exist. And I mean, all the people that have influenced me they kind of occupy and explore that sort of same territory. Poets like Seamus Heaney, Ted Hughes, painters like Anselm Kiefer, Schwitters again. His recycling is a form of bringing lightness out of dark. All this stuff that we throw away that he collected and then made these beautiful jewel-like pieces from. That's another form of transformation. So the filmmakers I watch and like, I think they all sort of delve in this territory.
You spoke a lot about your problems with the way that art is taught and the way the art education system works. And later in your career, you've actually become a lecturer yourself. Yeah. You've spoken all around the world at various different universities for a long time. Yeah. And I was wondering if you could tell me, what are the main messages you try and get across when you're speaking there? What do you find really important to educate people?
It's trying to enable them to find their own voice. That's what I enjoyed about lecturing and teaching. I particularly enjoyed tutorials, working with students one-on-one and trying to get them to open up. And I found that in a lot of instances, you find students that are doing work and they show you the work and you ask them what they're doing and they tell you how they've done it. And they very rarely tell you why they're doing it. So it's trying to unlock that, the actual thinking behind what they're doing. Most of what one sees is kind of derivative, and a lot of occasions I found people had kind of secret work or secret ideas that they didn't dare expose because they weren't part of the course. Again, this goes back to this specialisation, pigeonholing idea. Throughout my teaching career, the number of students I found who were writers, who wrote things down in sketchbooks and notebooks and never did anything with this writing. They kind of hid it away. It was either autobiographical or fictional or polemical. And this was where I thought the interesting stuff was, but they weren't doing anything with it. They weren't kind of translating that into anything artistic or visual. So it's a lot of the time I was spent trying to unpick all this and give them permission, if you like, to explore this territory.
Did you find that they responded well to that?
Yeah, although a lot of students were kind of a bit nervous because they knew that this wasn't part of the curriculum, this wasn't what they were supposed to be exploring, or they felt they weren't sure how they could integrate these ideas and other little areas of work into something more important or more appropriate for their course. They sort of feared other tutors coming down on them with a ton of bricks saying you can't do that. And I always encourage them to ignore that phrase, you can't do that. Whenever anyone says that to me, I think, well, I can then. That means I can.
BBC Radio Bristol.
Hello, lovely listeners of the Who's Flying the Plane podcast. My name is Adam Crowther and I present on BBC Radio Bristol. The show I present is a programme called Upload. It's a place for anyone who is making, creating and doing stuff to send us what they're making and get it featured on the BBC. So you could be a podcaster, a musician, a poet, a comedian. Maybe you've got your own blog. Record it, upload it and make 2021 the year that you get featured on the BBC. All you need to do is head to our website bbc.co.uk/upload for more information.
Upload with Adam Crowther.
Okay, Russell, what would you like to offer up as your Who's Flying the Plane hidden gem?
Well, this is really obscure. There's a writer I discovered called Margaret Evans. And her books, the books that one may be able to find are her kind of novels, which are okay, they're not brilliant, but she wrote a very slim thing called autobiography, which is more about living her life. She lived in Wales, she had a Welsh name but she was English, she died very young, and in it she just writes about living on this farm. She's trying to run a farm with her husband, struggling and also trying to write. But this book, autobiography, most of it is about trying to capture something that's going on right now and the impossibility of doing that.
What makes it stand out so much for you?
Well, the writing is lucid, it's beautiful, but she's also so desperately honest with the fact that her task, her idea of trying to capture these moments, these fleeting moments when they happen, is impossible. And that's exactly what I've been trying to do with my work. The work is a kind of constant trouble. It's static in one way, and yet it's lifeless in another. It's fleeting in one way, but it's also stolid, and unbudging. And it's trying to find a balance between work that is evidently static because it's physical nature, but also has the ability to move somehow, not just psychologically or emotionally, but physically. I've worked with lots of materials that if you move about in front of them, they shift, their colours shift, their angles shift, your viewing of them shifts. And I've been doing that with the installations as well. They're all sort of, to use Eno's phrase, they're generative in that whenever you are there in the middle of one of these installations, wherever you are in the space, your experience is completely different from someone else's, and it's completely different every single second you're in there. So she tries to kind of encapsulate this in her work, in this book, this little book, an autobiography, but it's really hard.
That's a big ask to get all of that into one piece of work. Is quite incredible.
I know. It's impossible. You have to you have to accept the kind of constraints of it, and that's something I learned with my fight against art education and the art world generally about this pigeonholing. Is that some of the constraints are necessary. I mean, a lot of great poetry, even contemporary poetry, is great because it works within known parameters and constraints that have been set up hundreds of years ago. This is the way to write a poem, and a lot of the poems that are free form, so-called, experimental poems, are a pile of shit.
Russell, how can people see what you do? How can they look at your work and experience what you are working on at the moment? And how can they keep up to date with what you do?
I guess via my website. There isn't anything on there about what I'm working on at the moment because I'm working on it.
Oh, right.
There's a few sort of textual news items on there, Alex, which kind of outline what projects I'm working on, but there's nothing visual. The latest work on there is from 2019, an exhibition I had in 2019.
Thanks a lot for talking to me today, Russell.
Okay, thank you.